Secrets, mysteries, and dangerous choices await you. But before we unravel every detail, subscribe to the channel and continue receiving stories that challenge your imagination. Ready to begin? The iron gate opened with a restrained, almost respectful creak, as if the structure itself recognized the weight of the place. The Whitmore mansion rested on the highest hill in Westbridge, California, dominating the landscape with its impeccable white facade, symmetrical columns, and expansive windows that reflected the morning sun. It was the kind of house that didn't need to boast to impose its presence. It simply stood there, sovereign. Daniel Harris parked his rental car a calculated distance from the main entrance, not out of shyness, but out of habit. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath and observed the scene for a few seconds. Perfectly manicured gardens, minimalist sculptures, discreetly positioned cameras. Everything there spoke of control, of ancient power, of someone accustomed to being in charge. Across the property, Thomas Whitmore ended a call as he walked toward the living room. At 63, he was a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Founder of a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate, Whitmore was known in business circles as ruthless, ironic, and to many, cruel. He didn't believe in coincidences, nor in emotional stories. For him, everything had a price, including people. "Has he arrived yet?" Thomas asked his assistant without slowing his pace. "Yes, sir. He's waiting at the gate." Whitmore smiled slightly, the smile of someone who had already decided the ending before the first act. "Let them in. I want to see who this guy is who just came to pick up the key." Daniel calmly got out of the car. He was wearing a simple shirt, dark trousers, and clean but worn shoes. Nothing about him stood out. No expensive watch, no status symbols, just a brown envelope under his right arm and an old keychain in his pocket. As he walked along the stone path to the entrance, he remembered the phone call from the previous night. The lawyer's voice was formal, almost embarrassed. "Mr. Whitmore asked you to come in person. He said he sees no point in intermediaries for something so simple." The front door opened before Daniel could ring the doorbell. Thomas Whitmore appeared with a glass of water in his hand, relaxed posture, and an assessing look. "So you're the boy with the key," he said without offering his hand. "Daniel Harris," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Yes, sir. I just came to settle this." Thomas let out a short, dry laugh. "Solve what exactly?" she asked, making room for Daniel to enter. "Because as far as I know, this house has always been mine." Daniel entered. The interior was even more impressive. Italian marble, original paintings, custom-made furniture. A veritable museum of success. Thomas noticed Daniel's quick glance sweeping around the room and interpreted it as envy. A common mistake, in his opinion. "Make yourself at home," he said, gesturing to the sofa. "This shouldn't take long." Daniel preferred to remain standing. "It won't take long." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Thomas sat down, crossing his legs with studied tranquility. "I'll be direct," said the millionaire. "I don't know who put it in your head that you have any right to this property, but this is a waste of time. If you're expecting money—" "I'm not," Daniel interrupted with restrained firmness. Thomas raised an eyebrow, amused. "Of course it is. Everyone is." Daniel took out the brown envelope and carefully placed it on the coffee table. He didn't push it. He just left it there. "I only came to get the key," he repeated, "and to deliver this." Thomas didn't open the envelope immediately. First, he laughed, a short, almost indulgent laugh, like someone listening to a badly told joke. "You show up at my house with that rehearsed speech, thinking you're going to intimidate me," she said. "Do you want to know how many people have tried something similar?" Daniel didn't answer. He just waited. The lack of reaction began to bother Thomas more than he had anticipated. With a theatrical sigh, he picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were old documents, carefully preserved, deeds, ownership records, a death certificate, and a letter folded in half. Thomas glanced quickly, still confident, but as he walked, the smile began to fade. His relaxed posture gave way to a slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Where did you get that?" he asked, now without humor. "They belonged to my father," Daniel replied, "and to his father before that." Thomas ignored the comment and pulled out the letter. He recognized the signature even before finishing reading. His jaw clenched. "That's impossible," he murmured. Daniel finally reached into his pocket and pulled out the object he had been carrying the whole time. He placed it on the table, next to the documents, an old, heavy key with the original coat of arms of the property engraved on the metal. "That key was never copied," Daniel said, "because it was never returned." Thomas stood up slowly. The man who had built empires now seemed, for the first time, genuinely disoriented. "Who are you?" he asked in a low voice. Daniel held her gaze. The true owner never needed to live here to remain the owner. Silence settled in again, denser, more dangerous. Outside, the wind swayed the trees in the garden. Inside the mansion, something had been broken, not physically, but on a much deeper level. Thomas Whitmore, who had always believed he controlled all the variables, realized that this simple visit was not an attempted coup. It was the beginning of a reckoning he never imagined he would have to face. Thomas Whitmore remained standing for a few seconds after the silence settled in, as if his body was still trying to keep up with the speed of information that his mind refused to accept. He walked slowly to the window, observing the garden he had redesigned 3 times in the last 10 years. Each tree had been personally chosen, each stone positioned to convey permanence. That house was not just a property, it was the symbol of his personal victory over a past he was determined to keep buried. "Westbridge wasn't like this when I first arrived," he said, without turning around. "It was a small, forgotten town. I transformed all of that." Daniel followed each movement attentively, but without anxiety. He knew that speech. He had grown up hearing fragmented versions of the same story, always told by someone who carried more resentment than nostalgia. "It did transform it," Daniel replied, "but it didn't start from scratch." Thomas turned abruptly. "You know nothing about what I've built." Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging a genuine but incomplete effort. "I know you bought land when nobody wanted it. I know you used different company names to hide acquisitions. I know you consolidated everything after prices skyrocketed. This is in the public records, and in those that aren't so public." The mention of the records made Thomas narrow his eyes. He approached the table again, picked up some documents, and leafed through them more carefully. Dates, signatures, old registry offices from a neighboring county. Every detail fit together uncomfortably. The letter, in particular, seemed to weigh a ton. Handwritten with firm handwriting, despite the age of the paper. Thomas remembered that handwriting. He remembered the man who had written it. "Your father," she began but stopped. "He wasn't a businessman," Daniel added. "He worked in maintenance, a gardener sometimes. He knew every inch of this property before there was even a mansion here." Thomas let out a nervous laugh. "Gardener?" he repeated. "Are you telling me that this house belongs to a family that never had the means to maintain it?" Daniel took a few steps around the room, observing the paintings, the shelves, the carefully chosen objects. "My grandfather bought the land when this was just an abandoned plot of land back in the 50s. He paid cash. He never built anything big because he never wanted to sell. The land was his long-term plan." Thomas felt a familiar unease, the kind that arises when a carefully constructed narrative begins to crack. He vaguely remembered that terrain, an old name on a contract, a small obstacle, too small to be taken seriously at the time. "Your grandfather died," Thomas said. "Your father too. The property was left without any recognized direct heirs. That's how I acquired everything legally." "Legally, yes," Daniel replied, Legitimately, no. The distinction hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel then spoke of himself, not as a confession, but as context. He grew up in different cities, always moving. His father avoided talking about the past, but never failed to pay symbolic taxes on land they no longer officially owned. When his father died, Daniel found the metal box hidden at the back of the closet, inside the documents, the key, and the letter. The letter didn't ask for revenge. It asked for patience. Thomas sat down again, now without any trace of superiority. Confidence had given way to a cold, almost legalistic analysis. "If this becomes public," he said, "you can't imagine the chaos it could cause. Investors, the press, lawsuits." "I can imagine," Daniel replied. "I've spent years imagining it." There were other characters orbiting that story, even without being present. Whitmore's former lawyer, now deceased. Employees who had been promoted for loyalty, not competence. An entire system built on small ethical concessions, each seemingly insignificant but devastating when viewed together. Thomas realized with a discreet shiver that Daniel wasn't there on a whim. There was method, there was time, and above all, there was something that money couldn't easily buy: silent persistence. "What do you want?" he finally asked. Daniel stopped in front of him. "Today," he replied, "nothing more than the acknowledgement that this story began before you." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the property. The mansion's once imposing walls now seemed like only a temporary backdrop. Thomas Whitmore understood at that moment that his greatest mistake had not been taking the land. She had to believe that no one would ever come back for her. Thomas Whitmore didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked to the built-in bar, and poured himself a whiskey he rarely offered visitors. The gesture wasn't one of courtesy, but of time. "I needed to organize the pieces before moving anything." "You chose a curious way to present yourself," he said, without looking at Daniel. "You could have come with lawyers, with the press, with a lawsuit." "That would come later," Daniel replied, "if necessary." Thomas turned slowly, the glass still suspended in the air. "So, there is an implicit threat." "There's a fact," Daniel corrected. "The threat arises when someone tries to ignore it." The millionaire took a short sip. The alcohol went down harshly, like the situation. For the first time in decades, he felt the discomfort of not being in immediate control of the situation. But he wasn't a man who had survived the corporate world by reacting on impulse. "Do you understand what you're up against?" he asked. "It's not just about a house. There are contracts, holdings, international funds. This property is the symbolic heart of it all." Daniel nodded. "That's precisely why I started here." The tension between the two gained a new layer. It was no longer just about possession, but about exposure. Thomas realized that Daniel understood the scope of what he had in his hands, and that made everything more dangerous. He discreetly activated the intercom. "Margaret, cancel my appointments for the rest of the day." On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence before the confirmation. That decision, small at first glance, revealed how seriously Thomas took the situation. "Let's talk like adults," he said, sitting down again. "Suppose you take this further. Suppose you manage to prove some historical inaccuracy. What do you think happens then?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, observing the slope of the land, the fences that marked the property's boundaries, the limits that had been redefined countless times over the decades. "I think the truth prevails," he said, "even when it's inconvenient." Thomas let out a short, almost melancholic laugh. "You're an idealist. That usually ends badly." "For some," Daniel replied. The conflict escalated when Thomas began to reveal his side of the story. He spoke of the beginning of his career, the difficulty of accessing credit, and the tough negotiations with banks and investors. He admitted without hesitation that he had taken advantage of legal loopholes, confusing records, and absent heirs. Not with pride, but with pragmatism. That's how the game worked, he said. Either you played or you got crushed. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. That story wasn't new to him, but hearing it directly from the man who had lived it gave the words a different weight. My father knew this, Daniel said. He didn't try to fight. He thought it wasn't worth confronting someone with limitless resources. Thomas tilted his head, acknowledging the point. And you think it's worth it? I think the time has come. The first concrete obstacle arose when Thomas made a proposal. Not an explicit bribe, but something carefully packaged as a rational solution. A significant sum of money, a confidentiality agreement, and the definitive closure of the matter. You would leave here today with more money than your family has ever had, he said, without exposure, without stress. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He picked up the old key from the table, slowly turning it between his fingers. This key doesn't just open a door, he said. It opens a story that was forcibly closed. Thomas realized that money wouldn't be enough. The conflict then took on new dimensions. He began to exert pressure behind the scenes. Phone calls were made. Digital files began to be accessed. Discreet investigations into Daniel began. Meanwhile, Daniel didn't stand still. He had prepared copies of the documents, distributed clear instructions to specific people, and laid out plans in case something happened to him. Not out of paranoia, but for learning purposes. For every move Thomas made, there was a silent reaction. For every attempt at veiled intimidation, an invisible barrier appeared. The conflict ceased to be merely personal and began to spread like a structural crack, small at first, almost imperceptible, but destined to grow. By the end of the night, Thomas realized something he hadn't felt in a long time: reluctant respect. Daniel wasn't naive, nor was he seeking immediate revenge. He was patient, and that was more dangerous than any frontal attack. You're not going to give up, Thomas said finally. No, Daniel replied. But there are still choices to be made. The silent mansion seemed to listen to every word, and amidst that restrained dispute, they both understood that the real conflict had only just begun. The following days brought no public announcements or explosive headlines. The conflict spread silently, almost invisibly, like an infiltration that only reveals the extent of the damage when it's too late. Thomas Whitmore maintained his external routine intact: meetings, charity events, carefully scripted interviews. Internally, however, the machinery was beginning to creak. One of the first subplots emerged from within the company itself. Michael Reed, legal director of the Whitmore conglomerate, received an unusual request to review old land acquisition contracts in Westbridge, dating back more than 30 years. It was not common to reopen files considered consolidated. Michael quickly realized that this was not just a routine audit. Any specific problem? He asked in a private conversation. Just a precaution, Thomas replied. I want to make sure everything is aligned. Michael began the review with the rigor his reputation demanded. The further he progressed, the more unsettling the findings became. Minor inconsistencies, altered records, witnesses who had signed documents without fully understanding what they were validating. Nothing illegal in isolation, but dangerously cumulative. Meanwhile, another subplot unfolded on Daniel's side. He returned to the city where he grew up and sought out old acquaintances of his father. He wasn't looking for declared allies, just confirmation. Short conversations, discreet meetings in cafes, forgotten by time. Gradually, accounts emerged of veiled pressures, rejected offers, bought silences. One woman in particular caught her attention. Eleanor Price, now retired, who had worked for years in the county registry office. She remembered the land. She remembered Daniel's grandfather's name. And above all, she remembered a night when she'd been instructed to speed up a specific process. I didn't think it was right at the time, she said, but nobody wanted to pick a fight with the big shots. This memory added another layer to the story. It wasn't just about documents, but about human choices made under pressure. Meanwhile, Thomas was dealing with a more personal complexity. His son, Andrew Whitmore, had returned from New York to spend a few weeks at the mansion. Young, successful, but distant from his father's business, Andrew sensed the tension in the air. "Did something happen?" he asked during a brief dinner. "Old news," Thomas replied. "Nothing you need to worry about." Andrew didn't insist, but he observed. He recognized that evasive tone. It was the same one he'd heard years before, when his mother had decided to leave the family. There were always old issues. Another subplot began to take shape when an investigative journalist, Laura Mitchell, received an anonymous tip about long-standing land disputes involving large real estate conglomerates. There were no names yet, only suggestions. Laura began to pull on loose threads, without realizing she was getting closer to something bigger. Time pressure was mounting. Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the matter spiraled out of his complete control. He needed to decide between two strategies, suppressing the problem or absorbing it in a controlled manner. Daniel, for his part, faced his own internal conflicts, not as long reflections, but as practical decisions. Each step he took brought the story closer to the public eye, something his father had always avoided. He had to choose between preserving the family memory or exposing it. The subplots began to converge when Michael Reed requested an urgent meeting with Thomas. "There are real risks here," he said cautiously. "If someone decides to question the original chain of ownership, we cannot guarantee a favorable outcome." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. "What if I decide to resolve this out of court?" Michael hesitated. "Then you'll have to give up something." On the other side of town, Daniel received an unexpected call, an unknown number. "I know what you're trying to do," said the voice on the other end. "And I know things you haven't discovered yet." The call dropped before Daniel could answer. The web of tensions tightened. Each character now carried partial information, their own motivations, and distinct moral boundaries. The main conflict fed on these ramifications, becoming more complex and more difficult to control. At the center of it all, Whitmore Manor stood motionless, as if observing the stories unfolding around it. A place built to represent stability, now threatened by truths that could no longer be ignored. The invitation arrived on letterhead, delivered personally by an employee of Whitmore Holdings. There were no explanations, only the date, time, and address. The mansion itself. Daniel read the card carefully, as if searching between the lines for some sign of a trap. He found none. Still, he knew that this meeting would mark a definitive change. On the appointed night, the weather in Westbridge was unstable. Low clouds moved slowly, heralding rain. The mansion, illuminated by discreet spotlights, seemed more austere than ever. When Daniel arrived, he was not led to the usual living room, but to the old office upstairs, a rarely used space laden with memories. Thomas Whitmore was already waiting for him. There was no whiskey in sight, nor a smile. "Thank you for coming," he said in a controlled tone. "We need to wrap this up." Daniel remained standing. Close or reset? Thomas made a vague gesture, perhaps both. On the table was a thick folder. Thomas opened it without ceremony and shoved some documents toward Daniel. "We discovered something that changes everything." Daniel examined the pages. They were copies of old bank records, loan agreements, signatures he immediately recognized. His father's name appeared more than once, associated with amounts he had never imagined. "That's not possible," said Daniel, feeling the weight of the shock. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Your father wasn't just a passive observer. He signed an agreement. He received money. He agreed not to contest the ownership." The silence that followed was unlike any before, denser, more personal. Thomas watched Daniel's reaction intently. This revelation wasn't a spur-of-the-moment trick. It had been discovered after days of internal investigation, and Thomas knew exactly where to press. "He did it to protect you," Thomas continued, "to prevent you from growing up in the midst of a legal battle. He chose silence." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not as an escape, but as an attempt to reorganize reality. Everything he had built up until then suddenly seemed unstable. "So you didn't steal everything," he said finally. "You just took advantage of someone who was tired." Thomas did not answer. That distinction no longer interested him. "If this becomes public," he said, "the narrative changes. You cease to be the wronged heir. You become the son of someone who accepted the deal and is now trying to rewrite history." Daniel felt the pressure closing in around him. This was the turning point, not just in the story, but in his own understanding of the past. "Why show me this?" he asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Because I don't want any more war. I want control over the outcome." He then revealed the true proposal. Not money, not silence, but something more complex. Thomas was willing to publicly acknowledge the property's origin, admit historical irregularities, and create an endowment fund in Daniel's family's name, provided that ownership of the mansion remained intact and the matter was legally closed. "You would gain recognition," Thomas said, "without destroying everything around you." Daniel realized that the offer wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a strategy. Thomas was trying to transform an explosive conflict into a controlled legacy, but there was more. Thomas revealed that the agreement signed by Daniel's father contained an obscure clause, the right to revert ownership if certain conditions were violated, conditions that it seemed had been breached years later. "Legally, this opens everything up again," Thomas admitted, "even for me." The revelation completely changed the balance of power. Neither of them now held an absolute position. Both were exposed. Outside, the first thunderclap echoed in the distance. Daniel stood up slowly. "My father made choices that I can't change," she said, "but I can decide what I do with what's left." Thomas held the gaze, recognizing something there that he could neither buy nor intimidate. Renewed conviction. "Think carefully," said the millionaire. "The next decision will define who you will be when all this is over." Daniel walked to the door, stopping before going out. "It also defines who you've been all this time." The door closed. Thomas remained alone in the office, staring at the scattered documents. For the first time, the outcome was not solely in his hands. The story had taken a different turn. The following morning dawned grey, as if the entire city shared the weight of the decisions yet to be made. Daniel woke up early without a sense of victory or defeat, only the certainty that nothing would be simple anymore. The revelation about his father didn't paralyze him, but profoundly altered how he viewed the conflict. Now, it wasn't just about historical justice, but about responsibility. He spent the day on the move, discreet meetings, short phone calls, encounters in neutral locations. Each action was a direct response to the previous night's upheaval. Daniel decided not to react emotionally. Instead, he acted with precision. The initial impact was internal. He revisited documents, cross-referenced dates, and meticulously reconstructed the timeline with almost surgical precision. The agreement signed by his father didn't end the story. It only postponed it. The reversion clause made everything more fragile than Thomas had admitted. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Thomas Whitmore faced a different kind of consequence. The confidence that had always accompanied him was giving way to constant vigilance. Every incoming call was analyzed. Every email was reread twice. He knew that any misstep could transform a contained conflict into a public scandal. Michael Reed insisted again. "Exposure is inevitable if this gets out of control," he said. "We need to define a clear strategy." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He was looking at an old portrait hanging on the office wall, a picture of himself younger, smiling, in front of his first major purchase. Now, that picture seemed almost naive. "Prepare 2 scenarios," he said finally. One for agreement, the other for total containment. Reactions also began to emerge outside the immediate circle. Laura Mitchell, the investigative journalist, advanced in her investigation. The pattern became evident, a sequence of acquisitions in valuable regions, always preceded by hushed-up land disputes. She didn't yet have definitive proof, but she had something almost as powerful: narrative coherence. Andrew Whitmore, for his part, began to notice cracks in his father's story. He met former employees, heard conflicting accounts, and felt the weight of a legacy he didn't fully understand. "You always said that everything was achieved through hard work," he said, in a tense conversation. "But it wasn't just that, was it?" Thomas held his son's gaze. "It was enough to survive." Andrew didn't answer, but that phrase echoed uncomfortably. Daniel, in dealing with the consequences, also faced external pressures. The anonymous call from the previous days was repeated, this time with more clarity. "There are people who don't want this resolved," the voice said, "neither for you nor for Whitmore." The message was simple. The conflict had gone beyond individual boundaries. There were greater interests at stake. Still, Daniel decided to move forward. He sent selected copies of the documents to an independent law firm, known for not bowing to large conglomerates. Not to initiate an immediate lawsuit, but to create a record, to leave a trail. Thomas sensed the movement almost instantly. His contacts alerted him. The reaction was immediate. He called an emergency board meeting. "This needs to be ended," he stated. "A public and controlled agreement is preferable to chaos." Emotional reactions began to manifest more strongly. Thomas, alone in his office at night, felt something close to regret. Not for what he had done, but for never having considered the human consequences of seemingly small decisions. Daniel, on the other hand, felt the weight of representing not only himself, but a story that had been silenced. He wasn't seeking destruction, but he also no longer accepted erasure. The consequences piled up, pushing them both toward an inevitable point. Each reaction generated another, like a sequence of dominoes about to fall. The conflict now demanded a resolution. There was no more room for delays, and they both knew the next step would define not only who would win, but what would be lost along the way. The decision to move forward visibly changed Daniel's demeanor. There were no internal speeches or silent promises. The transformation appeared in his actions. He stopped reacting to Thomas's moves and began to dictate the pace of the confrontation. Every choice was now made with full awareness of its impact. Daniel reorganized his strategy. Instead of focusing everything on a single legal outcome, he began to build alternatives. He sought out experts in property mediation, local historians, and urban planners who were familiar with Westbridge's expansion over the decades, not to inflate the conflict, but to understand it in its entirety. This movement represented growth. Before, its motivation was to correct a specific injustice. Now, it understood that it was dealing with an entire system shaped by convenience and silence. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitmore faced challenges that could neither be bought nor postponed. For the first time, he was forced to explain past decisions to people who wouldn't accept simplistic answers. The board demanded assurances. Investors wanted predictability. Trust, once automatic, needed to be rebuilt. "You've always been in control," Michael Reed said in a private meeting. "But control is not the same as legitimacy." The phrase hit Thomas harder than any legal threat. He realized he had spent his entire life confusing the two concepts. Andrew Whitmore became an unexpected element during that phase. The son began to get more directly involved, not out of ambition, but out of restlessness. He requested access to old documents, asked uncomfortable questions, and questioned versions he had always accepted without question. "If this comes to light," Andrew said, "I want to know exactly what we're talking about." Thomas hesitated, but allowed it. That small gesture indicated a slow but real change. For the first time, he was sharing the weight of the truth with someone from his own family. On Daniel's side, overcoming the challenge also took a practical form. He decided to make a part of the story public, not the most explosive documents, but the human context. He participated in a local event about urban memory, speaking about families displaced by real estate growth. He didn't mention names, he didn't make direct accusations, he simply presented facts. The reaction was immediate. People started sharing similar stories. The conflict was no longer isolated. Daniel was no longer alone. Thomas observed everything from a distance. He realized that trying to silence it now would be counterproductive. Every attempt at control would only reinforce the narrative he was trying to avoid. The personal growth of both became evident. Daniel learned to act without haste, to build legitimacy instead of demanding immediate recognition. Thomas, in turn, began to understand that his greatest challenge was not losing property, but redefining who he was without the myth of infallibility. Direct confrontation gave way to strategic moves. Meetings began to take place with mediators present. Conversations ceased to be power struggles and became negotiations about legacy. "I can't change the past," Thomas said at one of those meetings, "but I can take responsibility for what it caused." Daniel listened, assessed the situation, and didn't respond immediately. He knew that real growth isn't measured by words, but by compromises. External pressure continued, but now there was direction. Both were moving forward, not impulsively, but through conscious choice. Each step distanced the story from a destructive outcome and brought it closer to something more complex and more difficult. Overcoming this challenge didn't come as a clear victory for either side. It came as a forced maturation, as the understanding that some battles aren't won, only transformed. And at the end of that phase, both Daniel and Thomas knew they were ready for the final confrontation. Not as blind enemies, but as men who had been shaped by the conflict itself. Time became the scarcest resource, not because of artificial urgency, but because external conditions began to align irreversibly. The journalistic investigation progressed. The Whitmore Holdings Board was pressing for a clear resolution, and in parallel, the public narrative gained its own momentum, independent of the will of those involved. Daniel focused his efforts on tying up loose ends. Subplots that had formed along the way needed resolution before the final confrontation was possible. He met with Eleanor Price again, ensuring her testimony was formally recorded, not as an attack, but as historical preservation. He also spoke with Laura Mitchell. He didn't offer exclusivity or hand over sensitive documents. He only confirmed general outlines, advising the journalist to investigate responsibly. That decision revealed maturity. Daniel didn't want control of the narrative. He wanted transparency. Thomas, for his part, faced the gradual collapse of long-held certainties. The board demanded a definitive position on the ownership of the mansion, too symbolic to remain in a grey area. Michael Reed presented projections. Any attempt to prolong the impasse would exponentially increase the financial and reputational risk. "We're reaching the point of no return," Michael said. Silence is no longer an option. Andrew Whitmore played a crucial role in this phase. After weeks of analyzing documents, he confronted his father with a simple question. If this land wasn't ours from the beginning, why insist on keeping it now? Thomas didn't answer immediately. The question shattered decades of rationalization. For the first time, he considered the possibility of giving up, not because of external pressure, but by choice. Preparing for the climax also required Daniel to grapple with his own limitations. He received offers from groups interested in funding a full-blown legal battle in exchange for a share of future settlements. He refused them all. That would detract from the focus and turn the story into a spectacle. Instead, Daniel opted for a final move. He requested a public hearing at the Westbridge Municipal Council to discuss the land ownership history of the region. Legally, It was a legitimate request. Politically, it was a catalyst. The date has been set. Meanwhile, the mansion became the setting for intense meetings. Thomas authorized the preparation of an official statement, which was revised countless times. Every word mattered. He knew that this declaration would define not only the immediate outcome, but also how he would be remembered. On the eve of the hearing, Daniel and Thomas met for the last time before the climax. Not in the mansion, but in a neutral space, a simple room, devoid of symbols of power. "Tomorrow, everything changes," said Thomas. "It's already changed," Daniel replied. They both knew that this conversation wasn't about negotiating terms, but about acknowledging the inevitable. The choices had been made. The stage was set. Thomas returned home that night and walked through the mansion in silence. Each room held stories of achievements, but also of omissions. He realized with an unsettling clarity that this place had always been less about belonging and more about asserting oneself. Daniel, for his part, spent the night reviewing simple notes. He didn't prepare any fiery speeches. He knew the impact would come from the facts, not the rhetoric. The atmosphere in Westbridge was one of cautious anticipation. People were talking, journalists were waiting, authorities were preparing. The preparation was complete. The climax would not be a chaotic explosion, but an inevitable revelation, built step by step, choice by choice. And when it arrived, there would be no turning back. The days following the changes in Daniel and Thomas's attitudes brought a sense of inevitability to the air. The confrontation, which for so long seemed distant and changeable, was now about to reach a point of no return. Both, with their own processes of adaptation, knew that the game was about to end, and the outcome would be more than a simple victory or defeat. It would be a redefinition of the personal stories they were both trying to tell. The growing tension was no longer just about the land, the contracts, or the acquisitions. It had become a test of character, of legacy, and of each person's ability to make sacrifices that would balance the damage caused. Daniel had made the decision not to rush the process, but to ensure it happened at the right time. He sought allies, not the most obvious ones, but those with the power to discreetly influence public opinion, influential lawyers, respected journalists, and even some members of the business community who, for years, had distanced themselves from Thomas because of his way of doing business. He gathered evidence, not as an immediate threat, but as an ace up his sleeve to ensure his position was strong. He knew that logical or legal arguments alone wouldn't suffice. The key would be social support and the right narrative. The story needed to be told in a way that wasn't seen as revenge, but as a movement for justice, a reclaiming of control by those who had always been neglected. Thomas, for his part, had begun to prepare for what was to come. His meetings with investors became more frequent, his decisions more carefully considered. He was beginning to feel that the strategic moves that had sustained him for so many years now needed to be accompanied by a more transparent stance. He could no longer rely on obscure maneuvers. This would require more than financial control. It would require a redefinition of his own role in the public sphere. When he called a new meeting with his lawyers, the issue dominating the room was no longer defending the status quo, but seeking solutions that would allow for a transition without major losses. He knew it wouldn't be possible to erase what had happened. The only thing left to do was control how the story would be told to the world. "We need to end with a clear statement," Thomas said, his voice deeper than usual. "No beating around the bush, no ambiguity." Michael Reed, ever cautious, suggested an idea, a public negotiation with Daniel's family, which would guarantee a division of assets and an official acknowledgement of the situation. Nothing too serious, Thomas thought, just a way to put out the fire before it spreads. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to gather his allies and consolidate his position. He sought out an investigative journalist with enough credibility to produce a groundbreaking piece on Westbridge's shady past. His intention was not only to dismantle Thomas's empire, but to ensure his father's name was recognized as it deserved. The truth was at stake, but so was the honor his family had lost in the process. For weeks, the two sides prepared in silence, each trying to guess the other's next move. There was a palpable sense that something big was coming, but the exact moment had not yet arrived. It was then that Daniel received a phone call that brought both their preparations to fruition. An informant inside Whitmore Holdings, someone he had spoken to before, delivered devastating information. The endowment fund Thomas had created to protect his family's assets had somehow been manipulated to conceal a substantial portion of the property. The financial move was deliberate, designed to mislead the public valuation of Whitmore Holdings' assets. Daniel didn't hesitate. He knew he held the key to dismantling Thomas's entire power structure. It was the final proof that what he claimed wasn't just speculation, but the revelation of historical manipulation. That night, with the documents in hand, Daniel went to the home of his lawyer, an unbeatable professional who had become his greatest ally in the battle. They spent the night reviewing everything, preparing a strategy for legal action, but also for a public action. Thomas's preparation was underway as well, but a sense of unease accompanied him. He knew his position was weakening, that the control he had always exerted over the narratives was beginning to slip through his fingers. He felt he had been more honest with Daniel than he ever had been before. There was no point in hiding the past any longer. When the next morning arrived, the final piece was in place. Daniel had everything he needed, and Thomas had only one question. When the storm finally came, would he find the strength to accept the consequences? He knew he could no longer simply negotiate. Conflict was now inevitable. The day of the announcement arrived without fanfare. No advance press conference, no calculated leak. Just an official statement from Whitmore Holdings announcing an extraordinary revaluation of historical assets. Neutral, almost boring language. But those who knew how to read between the lines understood. Something big was about to happen. Daniel oversaw everything from a discreet office in the center of Westbridge. In front of him, the final documents were organized into 3 identical folders, one for the lawyers, one for the press, one for the county's public archive. Nothing there was impulsive. Every page had been checked, cross-checked, validated. On the other side of town, Thomas Whitmore prepared to face the moment he had avoided his entire life. There were no rehearsed speeches, only facts. He wore a simple suit, without the ostentatious cut he usually sported. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impose his presence, only to uphold his own position. The meeting took place in a municipal auditorium, chosen precisely for its neutral symbolism. Legal representatives, council members, journalists, and local authorities occupied the seats. It wasn't a courtroom, but it wasn't a comfortable stage either. Daniel entered unannounced. He sat in the second row, visible enough not to be ignored, discreet enough not to seem provocative. Thomas went up to the pulpit. "For decades," he began, "we built a narrative of growth and success in this city. Today, it's necessary to acknowledge that part of that history was built on decisions that no longer stand up to the full light of the facts." The murmuring began immediately. He continued. He spoke of confusing records, aggressive acquisitions, deliberate omissions. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't shift blame. Each sentence was measured, weighed, definitive. Then came the turning point. "The property known as Whitmore Mansion," Thomas said, "has not had its origins fully established. Documents presented in recent months prove that the original ownership belonged to the Harris family." The name echoed through the auditorium. Daniel felt the impact but didn't move. Thomas took a deep breath. "For this reason, we are formalizing today the historic reversal of the symbolic ownership of the property, along with a patrimonial agreement that recognizes the rights and history of this family." Symbolic. The word sounded strange to many, but Daniel understood exactly what it meant. It wasn't just money, nor was it just physical possession. It was public recognition, recorded, irrevocable. But Thomas wasn't finished yet. However, he added, additional documents reveal that an agreement signed decades ago transferred operational ownership of the property to Whitmore Holdings, with clauses that have remained valid to this day. The auditorium fell silent. It was there that everything could crumble or transform. Daniel stood up. He didn't ask for the floor. He walked to the pulpit when Thomas stepped aside, making room. The unexpected gesture was not stopped. "My father made a deal," Daniel said, looking at everyone, not just Thomas. Not out of ambition, but out of weariness. He believed that silence would protect the future, but silences that last too long become lies. He opened the third folder. The clause that kept this agreement valid was broken 22 years ago when the property was used as collateral in transactions that violated the original terms. The journalists leaned forward. "Legally," he continued, "this renders the agreement null and void. Morally, it was never enough." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He knew. He had always known. "I'm not here to expel anyone," Daniel concluded. "I'm here to correct what was erased." The final moment came without shouts, without applause, just with the signing of an additional document prepared that very morning, a public, irrevocable addendum. Whitmore Manor would be officially recognized as a historical landmark linked to the Harris family, with shared administration by an independent council. Thomas would retain the right to use it until the end of his life, but not absolute control. The empire remained, but the symbol changed hands. The protagonist's transformation became clear there. Daniel didn't seek destruction, he sought redefinition. Where there was once conflict, now there was structure. Where there was silence, now there was record. Thomas signed last. As she returned the pen, her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, from acceptance. The central conflict had been resolved, but nothing there seemed like a simple victory. The press conference was scheduled for a Monday morning in downtown Los Angeles. The location was no accident. A recently restored historic building, a symbol of the urban sprawl that had transformed entire cities, exactly the kind of setting that had sustained Thomas Whitmore's empire. Daniel arrived early. There was no visible tension in his gestures. He had already been through the worst. What was to come now was not fear, it was consequence. Thomas Whitmore entered minutes later, accompanied by lawyers and advisors. He walked with a firm posture, but his eyes betrayed something different, not arrogance, but rather controlled resignation. He knew that this moment could not be reversed. The room was full. Journalists, investors, city representatives, cameras rolling. Silence fell as Thomas approached the podium. "This statement," he began, "is not easy, but it is necessary." He spoke about the growth of Westridge, about decisions made at a time when efficiency was synonymous with silence. He admitted without hesitation that the original acquisition of the property had been built on ethically questionable agreements, taking advantage of the vulnerability of families without economic power. The impact was immediate. Murmurs spread through the room. Then Thomas did something that no one expected. The land where Whitmore Manor stands was never, in essence, mine, he said. It belonged to the Harris family. All cameras turned to Daniel. He stood up only when invited. He walked to the second pulpit, feeling the weight of decades condense into a few steps. There was no anger on his face, only firmness. "My father made a deal," Daniel said, "not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. He believed that silence would protect his family. Today I understand that choice, but I can't repeat it." Thomas listened without interrupting. Then came the final twist. Daniel presented the documents regarding the hidden endowment fund, the financial maneuver that had violated the reversion clause of the original agreement. Legally, this nullified any protection Thomas still had over full ownership of the property. By trying to protect too much, Daniel said, you lost what little control you had left. The silence was absolute. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, the struggle was over. The mansion will be transferred to an independent historical institute, he announced, with shared management and formal recognition of the Harris family as the original owners. It wasn't the destruction of the empire. It was something worse for a man like Thomas, the public correction of the narrative. Daniel felt the transformation happening right there, not as a personal triumph, but as closure. He wouldn't take the mansion for himself. He wouldn't live there. That house had ceased to be a home a long time ago. Some possessions, he said, are not meant to be occupied. They are meant to be remembered. The press conference ended without applause, only with the certainty that something irreversible had happened. Thomas Whitmore left the stage, knowing he would remain rich, influential, and powerful, but never again unchallenged. Daniel left the building without looking back. The conflict was resolved, but the real impact was only just beginning to spread. Months later, the mansion in Westbridge no longer symbolized absolute power. Part of its history was now public, recorded not only in documents, but in the collective memory of the city. Daniel never actually lived there. He preferred to keep his distance, as his grandfather had once done. Thomas Whitmore continued to live there, but without the same isolation that money had previously guaranteed. The property remained standing, but with plaques recounting its true origins. The old key was put away again, not as an instrument of possession, but as a reminder that some truths can take decades to open the right door. Stories like this remind us that not all wealth begins clean, and not all truth disappears forever. If this narrative made you reflect on justice, legacy, or the silent choices that shape the future, share your opinion. Do you believe the past should always be revisited, even when it threatens everything that has been built? Or should some truths remain buried? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, share this story with those who enjoy intense and realistic plots, and keep following for more narratives that challenge power, time, and consciousness.